Dust clung to everything in that town: window panes, boot leather, the creases of a man's face. By mid-afternoon, it drifted in the air so thick a man could taste it. The auction block stood in the square, a splintered platform that had seen everything from mules to men sold off beneath the dry eyes of the sheriff. That day, a tall figure stood on it, his wrists bound in iron, the links swaying faintly each time the wind pushed through. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, his hat brim casting his face into shade. But the sharp set of his jaw and the stillness in his posture made it clear he wasn't broken. The townsfolk gathered the way they did for trouble, half curious. Eager, a boy with freckles whispered to a woman in a shawl, and she crossed herself. A ranch hand muttered "cattle thief" to the man beside him. Another voice, lower, said, "half-blood outlaw," with the kind of edge that made it sound more curse than truth. The man on the block didn't flinch at any of it. The sheriff read out the charges. Words that sounded more like gossip than law, then called for bids. His voice was dry, like the wind through empty wheat stalks. Nobody spoke at first. It was one thing to watch a man stand chained under the sun. It was another to pay to take him home. From the edge of the crowd, movement broke the stillness. She stepped forward, a woman in a red calico dress, the fabric plain but carefully kept her, hair pinned neat against the heat. Her eyes carried something the crowd couldn't name, but they knew enough to step aside as she passed. "A widow," they whispered, "lives alone out past the scrubland. Doesn't ask for help, doesn't give much talk." She stood before the sheriff, not looking at the man on the block, not looking at the crowd, just speaking the figure in her mind. The amount was modest but final. A few in the crowd chuckled. One man snorted and spat in the dust. Still no one outbid her. The sheriff gave a short nod, and the iron was unlocked. The chain was handed to her as if it were nothing more than a lead rope for a mule. He stepped down from the block, his boots striking the boards with a deliberate heaviness. For the first time, his gaze met hers. There was no thanks in it, only the same unreadable measure he had shown the crowd. She turned without a word and began walking toward where her buckboard waited. The chain coiled in her hand, made a faint rattle with every step, an unwanted sound in the brittle air. The crowd watched them go, some shaking their heads, others already turning back to their own lives. The dust rose behind them, swallowing the square, the platform, and the eyes that had judged. They passed the last buildings at the edge of town without a single word between them. He kept pace beside her, his steps long, unhurried, as if matching her rhythm by choice rather than necessity. She didn't glance at him, and he didn't glance at the road ahead any more than he had to. Whatever bargain had been struck there, in the square, was bound by law, but not by trust. She didn't yet know why she had stepped forward. Only that something in the sight of him standing there silent, chained, unbent had made her act before she could think. And he, for all his watchful calm, didn't know whether the hand holding that chain meant safety or another kind of prison. The wind picked up as they moved further from the town, carrying the scent of dry sage and the distant promise of rain. That rarely came. The road stretched before them, a long, empty line. Neither spoke. The only sound was the slow creak of leather, the faint chink of iron, and the unspoken questions that trailed between them like shadows. The road beyond town narrowed to a track carved by years of wagon wheels, now softened at the edges by brittle grass. Each turn revealed more of the open land-rolling stretches of pale earth, scattered mesquite, and the stubborn clumps of wild sage that clung to life in the hard soil. The mare's hooves struck a slow rhythm, the creak of the wagon boards filling the quiet that neither of them seemed willing to break. She held the reins loosely, eyes fixed ahead, though she was aware of the man beside her in every small way. His hands were bound no longer, yet they stayed still in his lap. Knuckles scarred and rough from a lifetime of work or fights. She couldn't yet guess. When the wagon dipped into a shallow rut, he didn't look down at the road, but lifted, his gaze to the hills, scanning the distance as though danger might rise up from the grass at any moment. He, in turn, took in details she didn't know she showed. The hem of her red dress was frayed from years of wear, catching now and again on the splintered edge of the seat. Her fingers, small but strong, gripped the reins with quiet determination. They were the hands of someone who had done without help for a long time. By the time they reached her homestead, the sun had sunk low, drawing long shadows across the yard. The cabin stood plain and weathered, the roof patched with care, the porch steps sagging but sturdy. A single oak stood near, the well, its leaves whispering in the faint breeze. She led the mare into the small barn, unhitched the wagon, and without asking, he took to hauling in the small crate and feed sack from the back. Inside, the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and dried herbs. The lamplight cast a warm circle across the room, leaving the corners dim. A rocking chair sat near the hearth, its paint worn smooth from years of hands and evenings. On the far wall hung a shape that caught his eye, a wedding dress, pale and still, its lace edges yellowed with time. It hung as though waiting for a day that never came again. He looked at it only briefly, but it settled in his mind like a stone in water. They ate in near silence. The clink of cutlery against tin plates, louder than either of their voices. She served him bread and beans, nothing fancy, but hot and filling. He said nothing about the food, and she expected no thanks. The firelight caught on his profile, strong, weathered, unreadable. When the plates were cleared, she stepped outside with a bucket for water. Alone, he let his eyes wander. Above the mantel, a rifle hung in perfect readiness. Its stock was polished, the metal clean, the barrel free of dust. Not for show, for necessity. He knew the kind of life that kept a weapon that wet wasn't. A choice. It was survival. Outside, the night was open and quiet. She stood by the well, the bucket full but forgotten for the moment, her eyes tilted to the wide sweep of stars overhead. The air was cooler now, the breeze brushing against her cheeks. She thought of the man she had buried on this land years ago, and the child who had never drawn breath. Those memories came like ghosts, soft, familiar, and heavy all at once. Inside, he sat with his elbows on his knees, staring into the flames. In the crackle and pop of the fire, he heard another sound from years back, the murmur of a crowd, the clink of chains, the taste of dust in his mouth as he stood waiting for someone to decide his fate. He didn't know why she had stepped forward today, but the memory of her voice, steady and certain, kept returning. Neither spoke of what they carried. But it was there in the room between them. The dress, the rifle, the silence. The fire burned low, the night settling over the cabin like a blanket, and still neither moved to close the distance between them. They were strangers yet, but both could feel the weight of the other's burdens resting somewhere near their own. The days found their own rhythm. He rose early, moving with quiet purpose, taking to the work of the place without being told. The fence posts, long leaning from wind and weather, stood straighter under his hands. The water buckets were filled. Before she reached for them, the barn swept clean, the mare's coat brushed until it caught the light like copper in the sun. She watched him from the porch sometimes, noting the way he handled old tools as though they were worth more than gold. How he paused to let the mare nudge his shoulder before he moved away. She spoke little, but she noticed everything. He, in turn, seemed to know the edges of her land as well as she did within a week. And though he kept his eyes mostly down, she felt his attention was on more than just the work. Late one afternoon, as the air hung heavy and still, the sky in the west began to gather itself into a wall of cloud, dark and close, the kind of storm that made the prairie hold its breath. She stepped out from the cabin and told him to see to the shutters while she brought in the wash. The wind picked up quick, tugging at her skirt, pulling her hair loose from its pins, but the wind carried more than the smell of rain. From the rise beyond the barn came the dull thud of hooves, and soon 3 riders appeared, faces shadowed by wide brims and scarves drawn high. They didn't dismount. Their voices were low, sharp. Riding the wind to the porch where she stood, they spoke his name, not the one she had heard in town, but another. Said he owed a debt, a blood debt, to kin they'd buried. The words dropped heavy between them. Meant to draw out shame or fear, she felt him step up from behind her, his presence quiet but solid. Before he could speak, she shifted, planting herself between him and the men. The wind tore at her shawl, snapping its ends like a banner, but her voice was steady when she said he was under her roof. The rider's eyes narrowed. One leaned forward, in his saddle, looking past her, but she didn't move aside. "We'll come again," the tallest one said, his words half promise, half threat. They turned their horses and rode back into the darkening plain, swallowed by the storm's edge. By the time the first drops hit the dust, they were gone. He finished securing the last shutter, his jaw set, his eyes on the horizon long after. The riders had vanished. She didn't ask him what the debt was, and he didn't offer, at least not then. That night the storm came down hard, rattling the cabin walls. Rain lashed against the roof in sheets, and thunder rolled through the hills, like distant gunfire. She poured coffee into tin cups, the steam curling in the lamplight. And they sat at the small table, listening to the wind claw at the door. When he did speak, it was slow, measured. Each word weighed before it left him. He told her pieces of a story, not enough to name the whole truth, but enough to show where the wound had been cut. A fight over stolen cattle, a man dead in the dirt, a family that had sworn to take payment in blood. Her hand stayed wrapped around her cup as she listened. She didn't ask if he was guilty. She could see in his eyes that the answer wasn't simple. The rain's steady drumming filled the silence between his words, a rhythm neither of them broke until the coffee was gone and the fire burned low. When she finally rose to bank the coals, he caught her glance just long enough for her to see. Something shifts, less guarded, less alone. Outside, the storm still raged, but inside, the air had changed. The distance between them had narrowed, though neither spoke of it. The morning broke clean after the storm, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth and the faint temps of wood smoke drifting from the chimney. The ground was soft underfoot, the puddles in the yard holding pale slices of sky. She stepped onto the porch and found him already there, crouched low, a hammer in his hand, mending the rail where the wood had splintered. His movements were steady, measured, each nail set with quiet precision. She lingered at the doorway for a moment before stepping out. He glanced up, their eyes meeting for the briefest breath before he looked back to his work. It happened again. Later, when she passed him in the yard carrying kindling, his gaze lifting, hers catching it, both pulling away as if afraid to hold on too long. The hours slipped by in this manner, filled with the hum of small chores and the unspoken thread. Running between them, still tension simmered beneath it all. She felt the weight of whispers from town each time she thought of riding in for supplies, knowing eyes would follow her and tongues would turn. A widow bringing home a man with enemies, it would feed the talk for weeks. For him, it was the unease of staying too long in one place. A man marked by certain names couldn't linger without drawing trouble, and trouble didn't always knock before it came in. He caught himself looking toward the horizon more than once, the habit of a man who expected to leave before the ground settled. Beneath his boots, small things reminded them of the distance between their worlds. He bowed his head in. A way unfamiliar to her, something private, quiet, and older than the church in town. She folded her hands, waiting to speak until Grace was done, unsure whether to say anything at all. When he worked leather in the barn, she noticed the stitching patterns that spoke of another life, other people, something he didn't offer. To explain, one afternoon they were both at the far fence, repairing where the storm had brought down a section. The air was warm, the sun pressing down through the thinning clouds. She held the post steady while he worked the wire taut, his hands brushing close to hers. A slip in the tension made the wire snap suddenly, the sound sharp in the quiet. Stumbled back a step, and he caught her by the arm before she could fall against the post. For a moment, they stood too close, the smell of rain still in the fabric of their clothes, his hand warm against her sleeve. She looked up, and the nearness startled her more than the snap of the wire had. His eyes held hers, not searching, not pleading, just fixed there with a heat that seemed to rise from somewhere deep. She stepped back quickly, the space between them opening again, but not wide enough to take away what had passed in that instant. He let his hand fall, turning back to the work as though nothing had happened. But but she could still feel the press of his fingers through the cloth. The rest of the afternoon was quiet in a different way. Every sound, the creak of wood, the rasp of wire, the sigh of the wind made sharper by the unspoken thing now alive between them. Neither named it, neither invited it, but both carried it back to the cabin when the light began to fade. The night was quiet enough to hear the wind sifting through the dry grass beyond the yard, the kind of stillness that made every sound sharper. He had been mending tack by the fire when the faint drumming of hooves reached his ears. It was too late for travelers, too deliberate for neighbors. He set the leather aside and stepped to the door. They came into view from the dark. 3 shapes on horseback, torches burning in their hands, the light licking against their faces. He opened the door wide enough to step out, the cold air cutting against the warmth of the room. The door shut behind him with a hollow thud. He stood in the yard, unarmed, though his stance was solid, as if the ground itself had risen to meet him. The leader reined in close enough for the torchlight to catch his jaw, the scarf still pulled up high. Words came sharp, accusing, wrapped in the weight of a grudge carried too far to put down. He answered without flinching, warning without threat. They shifted in their saddles, their horses stamping at the frozen earth. One of the riders nudged forward a step, torchlight sliding across the wet glint of his eyes. Then the cabin door opened again, and she was there. The rifle rested against her shoulder as naturally as if it were an extension of her own arm. The torchlight caught her face, steady and unyielding, her shawl drawn tight against the night wind. She didn't raise her voice, but it carried clear, telling them he was under her roof and they'd best ride on. The leader's eyes flicked from her to him, measuring. Then one rider jerked his chin forward and let his hand fall toward the knife. At his belt, in the same heartbeat, the rifle cracked, the shot splitting the night wide open. The bullet struck dirt inches from the man's horse, which reared and wheeled away with a startled cry. The sound hung in the air a long moment before the riders turned back into the dark. The red flare of their torches shrinking against the black hooves faded. The wind returned. Inside, the fire still burned, but its heat seemed different now. She leaned the rifle against the wall, her hands steady as she unwrapped her shawl. He stood a moment longer by the door before stepping. Closer to the hearth, in the flicker of the flames, they could see what had been kept from each other until now, the years of running worn into his face. The years of loneliness shadowed in hers. He spoke her name softly, the first time he'd said it without the distance of formality. Then came the words quiet, meant for no one but her. He thanked her, not just for the shot, but for not letting them take him, not letting them define him by their claims. Her hand moved almost without thought, resting on his arm. It was a brief touch, but in it was more than comfort, it was recognition. The line between them, once drawn hard and clear, softened in that instant. The fire popped, sending a faint ember toward the hearthstone, and neither moved to speak again. The room held the warmth for them both, and the unspoken truth settled between them like something finally found. The first light of dawn stretched long and pale across the dirt street, catching the frost that had settled in the night. He stood there already, boots planted, rifle balanced in his hands. The air held that kind of stillness that comes before something must break. Beside him, she waited, her shawl drawn close. The weight of her presence as certain as the rifle he carried. The riders came slow this time, their horses' breath steaming in the chill. No torches now, only the dull glint of morning on steel buckles and the set of hard faces. They reined in a short distance away, the leader's eyes measuring the CN2 figures standing, side by side, neither moving, neither looking ready to give ground. The words came low and even, a negotiation stripped of all pretense. Names were spoken, debts laid out plain. He met each claim without flinch, not pleading, not denying, but setting truth where it belonged. The leader listened, glancing once at the woman who stood unmoving at his side. Something in her steady gaze seemed to shift the air between them. At last, the leader nodded once, the kind of gesture that closed a chapter. "We'll stay away," he said, and turned his horse. The others followed without another word. The sound of hooves faded into the quiet, leaving only the creak of leather and the sigh of wind through the dry grass. They didn't speak until They were past the yard, riding together toward the far edge of her land. The sky was a clean, sharp blue after the long storm, the earth smelling of rain and frost. He told her he would go, that he'd stayed longer than he should. She kept her eyes on the horizon, her hands steady on the reins, and said nothing. When he reached to take the bridle from her, she did not let go. Instead, she told him there was work enough here for two, shelter for the winter, and a place if he wanted it. The words were plain, without flourish. But they carried more weight than anything she had spoken to him before. He didn't answer right away. The quiet between them was no longer brittle but full, like soil that had taken in the rain. When they turned the horses back toward the cabin, the sun was high enough to cast the first warmth into the air. Inside, the day carried on as if nothing had happened. But on the wall by the door, the chain that had once bound his wrists now hung, its iron dulled and rusted by time. He touched it once with his fingertips, then let it hang where it was. That night, the fire burned low, its light steady and warm across the room. She sat in the rocking chair, mending a tear in her shawl. He worked quietly at the table, shaping leather with hands no longer bound. They did not speak of the morning or of what might come next, but the space between them had changed. Outside, the wind moved through the grass like a slow tide. Inside, the cabin held its warmth, and somewhere in that shared silence was the knowledge that, for the first time in years, neither of them was alone.